It started with a fever. Small, almost harmless. The kind that mothers notice before anyone else does. The kind that seems manageable, temporary, something that will pass with rest and care, something that doesn't belong to danger. But this one didn't pass. Tu Tian sat beside Bo, her hand resting gently on his forehead, her brows slowly tightening as the heat refused to go down, her heart beginning to race in quiet, growing fear, the kind that builds slowly, silently, until it takes over everything. "Bo, can you hear Mommy?" she whispered softly. The little boy stirred weakly, his usual bright energy replaced by a heavy stillness that didn't belong to him. That was when she knew. Something was wrong. The village was calm that morning, wrapped in mist and familiar sounds, but inside the small wooden house, time seemed to move differently, heavier, slower, filled with tension that no one could see from the outside. She tried everything she knew: cool cloth, herbal remedies, holding him close, whispering to him. But nothing changed. His breathing became uneven, his body burned hotter, and fear turned into panic. "Tian, what's happening?" a neighbor asked, stepping into the house after hearing the urgency in her voice. "He won't wake up properly. His fever isn't going down," Tu Tian said, her voice shaking despite her effort to stay calm. The older woman touched Bo's forehead and immediately frowned. "This is not normal," she said. "You need to take him to a hospital." Tu Tian's heart dropped. The nearest proper hospital was far, too far. The village clinic was small, limited, barely equipped for serious conditions, but it was all they had. "Help me," she said quickly. Within minutes, they were there. The small clinic smelled of medicine and wood, the doctor moving quickly but with a seriousness that made everything worse. "How long has he had this fever?" the doctor asked. "Since last night, but it got worse this morning," Tu Tian replied, holding Bo tightly. The doctor checked him again, and then. He looked at her, a look she would never forget. "He needs to be transferred," he said. "This could be an infection. Or worse, we don't have what we need here." The words hit like a storm. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely holding together. "If we delay, it could become critical." Critical. Her hands tightened around Bo. Her mind raced. She had no car, no fast way down, no one nearby who could help quickly enough, and for the first time, she felt completely helpless. Back in the city, Jack hadn't slept well. Something felt off, not logically, not clearly, but deeply. He stared at his phone, the same message thread that hadn't been updated in days, the same silence that had become familiar, but this time, it felt different. He didn't know why, but he couldn't ignore it. "I'm going," he said suddenly, grabbing his keys. His assistant looked up, confused. "Going where?" Jack didn't hesitate. "To her." The drive felt endless. Every minute stretched, every second heavier than the last, as if something was pulling him forward, something urgent, something he couldn't name but couldn't ignore. When he finally reached the village, something was wrong. Too many people outside, too much tension in the air. He stepped out of the car quickly. "What happened?" he asked. Someone pointed. "The clinic." Jack didn't wait. He ran. Inside, the air was thick with urgency, voices low but tense, and then he saw her. Tu Tian, sitting there, holding Bo. Her face pale, her eyes filled with something he had never seen before. Fear, real fear. "Tian." She looked up, and for a moment, everything stopped. "Jack," she whispered. Not anger, not distance, just relief, and that alone told him how serious it was. He moved closer immediately. "What's happening?" "He's not getting better. They said he needs to go to the city. Now," she said, her voice breaking. Jack didn't ask anything else, didn't hesitate. "Come," he said firmly. Within minutes, they were in the car. Lay in Tu Tian's arms in the back seat, his small body too still, his breathing shallow, and she held him like she was holding on to his life itself, whispering to him, begging silently, praying in a way she never had before. "Stay with me, please, stay with me." Jack drove faster than he ever had, Nothing else mattered. Not rules, not consequences, not anything. Only one thing: getting there in time. "Bo, can you hear Daddy?" he said, his voice tight, his eyes flicking to the mirror. No response. Tu Tian's tears fell silently, and for the first time since she left the city, she didn't think about herself, didn't think about pain, didn't think about distance. Only one thing existed: her son. "Don't leave me," she whispered. Hours later, the hospital doors opened. Doctors rushed in, voices overlapped, machines beeped, and Bo was taken from her arms, just like that. Behind a door she couldn't follow, Tu Tian stood frozen, empty. Her arms still held the shape of him, but he was gone. Jack held her shoulders. "He's going to be okay," he said. But this time, even he wasn't sure. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like something endless, until finally, another presence entered the hallway. Jack's mother. She had come, dressed as always, composed, controlled. But when she saw them, everything changed. She saw Tu Tian, broken, shaking, barely standing. And for the first time, she didn't see a girl who didn't belong. She saw a mother. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice lower than usual. "In surgery," Jack replied quietly. Silence. Heavy. Unavoidable. Tu Tian didn't look at her, didn't have the strength to. But slowly, unexpectedly, a hand touched her shoulder. Gentle. Careful. Not controlling. Not judging. Just there. "It's going to be all right," Jack's mother said softly, and for the first time, there was no distance in her voice, only concern, real, human, and something inside her had already begun to change. The red light above the operating room door refused to turn off. It stayed there, unmoving, unforgiving. Each second it remained lit felt like a weight pressing deeper into Tu Tian's chest, until breathing itself became something she had to fight for, until even the act of standing felt like too much. She hadn't moved, not since they took Bo away. Her hands were still trembling, her fingers curled slightly as if she was still holding him, still trying to keep him close, still refusing to let go of something she couldn't control anymore. Jack stood beside her, silent. Not because he didn't have anything to say, but because nothing felt enough. And for once, he understood that words couldn't fix this. Across the hall, his mother sat down slowly, her posture still composed out of habit, but her eyes never left the operating room door, her fingers tightening slightly over her handbag, as if she needed something to hold on to. She had seen many things in her life: power, pressure, reputation, loss, in different forms. But this was different, because this wasn't distant. This was her family, and for the first time, she felt it, fully. A nurse walked past quickly. Tu Tian reacted instantly. "Please, how is he?" she asked, her voice barely holding together. The nurse paused, offering a small, careful smile. "They're doing everything they can." Everything they can. It wasn't an answer, but it was all they had. Time stretched. Minutes dissolved into something shapeless, until finally, the red light turned off, the door opened, all three of them stood up at the same time. The doctor stepped out, serious, but not hopeless. "We managed to stabilize him," he said. Tu Tian's knees nearly gave out. Jack caught her immediately. "He's still in a critical condition, but he responded well," the doctor continued. "The next 24 hours will be very important." Relief didn't come all at once. It came slowly, carefully, like something fragile. "Can we see him?" Jack asked. "Only briefly." They entered the room together. Bo lay there, small against the machines surrounding him, his chest rising slowly, unevenly, his face pale but calmer than before, and Tu Tian stepped forward like she was approaching something sacred, something she was afraid might disappear if she moved too quickly. "Bo," she whispered. Her hand hovered above him for a second, then gently touched his. Warm, still warm. That was enough. Her tears finally fell freely, not of fear this time, but of release. Jack stood beside her, his hand resting on her back, steady, present, not trying to lead, not trying to fix, just there, the way he should have been all along. And behind them, his mother watched, quietly, taking everything in, every detail, every emotion, every truth she had refused to see before. That night, something changed completely. Tử Tiên refused to leave Beau's side, even when the nurses suggested rest, even when her body began to give in. "I'm staying," she said simply. Jack didn't argue. He understood. But what surprised him was his mother. "I'll stay too," she said. Both of them turned to look at her. "You should rest," Jack said instinctively. She shook her head. "No." There was something firm in her voice, something different. "I've rested enough in my life," she added quietly. And without waiting for permission, she stepped closer to Beau's bed, sat down, and gently adjusted the blanket around him. The movement was careful, uncertain at first, but real. Hours passed, then more. The hospital lights dimmed. The city outside grew quiet, but inside that room, no one left. At some point, Tử Tiên leaned back slightly, exhaustion finally catching up with her, her eyes closing just for a moment, her body giving in after holding on for too long. Jack noticed immediately. "You need to sleep," he said softly. She shook her head weakly. "I can't." Before he could respond, his mother spoke. "I'll watch him." The words were simple, but they carried something else. A shift. Tử Tiên hesitated, for a second, because trust didn't come back easily. But then, she looked at Beau, then at the older woman, and slowly, she nodded. Jack guided her to a nearby chair, and for the first time in days, she closed her eyes fully, not in fear, but in fragile peace. Across the room, his mother remained by Beau's side, watching him, carefully, her hand resting lightly near his, not touching at first, as if she wasn't sure she had the right. But then, slowly, she did, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than it had ever been. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Not to Jack, not to Tử Tiên, but to the child, to the family, to everything she had misunderstood. Morning came gently, and with it, a small miracle. Beau moved, just slightly. His fingers twitched, his eyes opened halfway, weak, but aware. "Mom," he murmured. Tử Tiên woke instantly. I'm here," she said, rushing to him, her voice breaking again. Jack stood beside them, his hand gripping the edge of the bed, and his mother stepped back, not because she wasn't needed, but because she understood where she belonged now, not above, not in control, but beside them. As part of a family she had almost lost, days later, Beau began to recover, slowly, but surely. And the room that once held fear now held something else, something warmer, something quieter, something real. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered softly through the window, Jack's mother approached Tử Tiên. There was no tension, no distance, only something unfamiliar, humility. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said. Tử Tiên looked at her, surprised. "But I want to learn," she continued, "if you'll let me." The words hung in the air, gentle, honest, and for the first time, Tử Tiên didn't feel pressure, didn't feel judged. She felt seen. "You don't need to change overnight," she replied quietly. "Just don't push me away anymore." The older woman nodded. That was enough. Not a perfect ending, not a full reconciliation, but a beginning. And as Beau laughed softly in the background, his voice filling the space with life again, the three of them stood there, not as strangers forced together by circumstance, but as something slowly becoming whole, not complete, not certain, but healing. And sometimes, that's where love truly begins.